Welcome to David's Stories. Today we follow Winfred, a devoted father betrayed by his daughter's rejection, who reveals a life-changing truth, heals their bond, and reclaims his role. Subscribe and hit the bell for weekly videos uncovering heartfelt truths. Share your thoughts below. Let's start the stories. The knife hovered above the carrot, trembling in my grip as her voice sliced through the quiet of my kitchen. The blade caught the dim light from the single bulb overhead, casting a jagged shadow across the cutting board. It was 7:30 p.m., and the steam from the pot of chicken broth behind me curled upward like a ghost, filling the air with the scent of time and solitude. My small house, tucked in a forgotten corner of this suburban labyrinth, had grown too quiet these past 5 years. Too quiet except for moments like this when Agnes called. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was flat, like a blade dulled by overuse, carrying the weight of obligation rather than affection. I set the knife down, the clink against the wooden board louder than it should have been. My shoulders tensed, bracing for the inevitable. "Look, I can come to this Father's Day thing of yours, but not for long." I wiped my hands on the dish towel tucked into my belt, the fabric worn thin from years of use. "Of course, Agnes," I said, forcing a brightness into my tone that felt like a lie. "I'd be happy to see you even if it's just for a little while." The words tasted like ash. I stirred the soup, watching the vegetables swirl in lazy, aimless circles, much like my thoughts. "Right. Well, I'll probably drive over around noon on Sunday, but I can't stay past 3. I promised Mom and Eldon I'd help with their garden party." Her words landed like a stone in my chest. Their garden party. Not our Father's Day. Not our time. Eldon. The man who'd slipped into my life like a thief, stealing the roles I'd spent decades building: husband, father, provider. I could picture him now, standing in his manicured backyard, his tailored suit pristine, his smile smug, while my daughter called him Dad with an ease that cut deeper than any knife. "That sounds lovely." I managed my voice steady, despite the ache. "I was thinking of making that roast you used to love. Remember? The one with the herb crust?" A pause, then a laugh that held no warmth. "Just don't cook that turkey from the 80s, okay? That thing was dry as cardboard." I hadn't cooked turkey for Father's Day, not once in 33 years. But correcting her would only widen the chasm between us. I turned down the heat under the pot, buying time to swallow the hurt. "Of course not. I'll make something special. Maybe we could look through some old photos while you're here." I ventured, my voice softer now, grasping for a thread of connection. "I found those albums from when you were little." "Dad, I really can't stay long. 3 hours max, and that's pushing it." 3 hours. After a year of unanswered texts, missed calls, and fleeting visits, 3 hours was all I warranted. I leaned against the counter, the cold edge biting into my palms. The kitchen felt emptier than ever, one bowl by the stove. One spoon, one man staring at a life reduced to fragments. 3 hours sounds perfect. I lied, the words heavy on my tongue. "We'll make the most of it." "Good. And Dad, maybe try to, I don't know, keep things light. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about your problems or whatever. My problems." As if missing my daughter was a trivial complaint, like a leaky faucet or a late bill. I closed my eyes, counting to 3 as my therapist had taught me, the numbers anchoring me against the rising tide of hurt. "Absolutely. Just a nice relaxing afternoon," I said, the promise hollow even to my own ears. "Great. Okay, I need to go. Eldon's calling me for dinner." Eldon's calling. The phrase twisted like a blade in my gut. At 7:30 on a Thursday, she was dining with my ex-wife Lula, and the man who'd replaced me in every way that mattered. "Give my regards to your mother." I said, the words bitter as they left my mouth. "Will do. See you Sunday." "Dad?" The line went dead before I could say goodbye. I stood there clutching the phone, the dial tone blending with the gentle bubbling of the soup. The carrots on the cutting board had started to dry at the edges, half-chopped, abandoned. Like me. The house was too still, the kind of quiet that amplifies every creak, every sigh of the old walls. I set the phone down and turned back to the cutting board, the knife foreign in my hand, now heavier than it should be. I resumed chopping each slice, measured with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years as an engineer, building bridges, designing systems, creating order from chaos. Some habits die hard, even when the world around you crumbles. But the soup could wait. I abandoned it, the vegetables left to overcook in their simmering broth. Agnes's voice lingered in the air, her casual dismissal, sharper than any outright rejection. I wandered to the living room, drawn by an instinct I couldn't name. The photo albums sat on the bottom shelf of my bookcase, their leather spines worn but intact like relics of a life I barely recognized. I pulled the oldest one free, dust motes swirling in the lamplight as I sank into my armchair. The pages creaked as I opened them, revealing a snapshot from 2019, our last real Christmas together. Lula in her red sweater, Agnes with her arm around my shoulder, all of us smiling like we meant it. Before Eldon. Before the engineering firm downsized me into oblivion. Before the divorce papers, yellowed and coffee-stained, marked the end of everything I'd built. I traced the edges of the photo, the memory sharp enough to cut. 5 years ago, my world unraveled. The firm let me go at 60, too old to start over, too young to retire. The severance lasted 8 months. 8 months of resumes vanishing into digital voids, of watching Lula's patience erode like sand under a relentless tide. She started working late, attending book club meetings that stretched past midnight, taking phone calls in hushed tones from the other room. Her voice grew lighter, younger, as if she were rediscovering a version of herself I'd never known. When she finally told me about Eldon, I wasn't surprised, just empty. "He makes me feel like myself again," she'd said, as if our 32 years of marriage had erased her instead of shaping her. "He sees potential in me." Unlike me, apparently, the man who'd worked double shifts to put her through graduate school, who'd celebrated every promotion, every milestone. But potential was a luxury we couldn't afford after my job disappeared. I flipped through more photos, each one a pinprick to the heart. Agnes at 10, gap-toothed and grinning beside the treehouse I'd built her. Agnes at 16, rolling her eyes at my dad jokes but laughing despite herself. Agnes at 25, calling me for advice about her first job, her voice bright with trust. When had that trust fractured? It started slowly, like a hairline crack in a foundation, barely noticeable until the whole structure tilted. Her calls grew shorter, her visits obligatory. She stopped asking my opinion and started quoting Eldon's wisdom. Instead, the successful businessman who'd filled the void my unemployment left behind. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, a programmed comfort for my solitary evenings. I'd made coffee mechanically through the dissolution of my marriage, through Agnes's gradual shift in loyalty to a man who offered stability, confidence, a future without question marks. I pulled another album from the shelf, this one from her college years. Her graduation photo showed her beaming between Lula and me, my arm around her waist, Lula holding her hand. We'd looked like a team then, unbreakable. 2 years later, Lula remarried. 6 months after that, Agnes started calling Eldon her bonus dad. The phrase made my stomach churn, as if fathers were interchangeable like spark plugs in an engine you could swap out when the original failed. I closed the album and stood my reflection caught in the dark kitchen window. A 65-year-old man graying at the temples, lines etched deeper by loss. 3 hours. After 33 years of fatherhood, I'd been reduced to a 3-hour slot in my daughter's busy schedule. But there was something else. Something I hadn't told her, hadn't told anyone. A secret buried in the pages of those albums, in the documents locked in my desk drawer, in the choices I'd made long before she called anyone dad. A truth that could unravel everything she thought she knew about family, about love, about me. I'd kept it hidden for decades, not out of shame, but because some truths are too heavy to carry in casual conversation. Yet as I stood there, the weight of her dismissal pressing against my ribs, I felt the secret stirring like a shadow moving beneath still water. I returned to the kitchen, the soup now a forgotten mess. The carrots were mush, the broth cloudy, but I didn't care. I poured it down the sink, the gurgle echoing the hollowness in my chest. Sunday was coming, and with it my chance to reclaim something, maybe not her love, but her understanding. I'd cook her favorite roast, set the table with the good china Lula left behind, and prepare for a day that could either mend us or break us completely. As I washed the dishes, my hands moved on autopilot, scrubbing away the remnants of my solitary meal. But my mind was elsewhere, piecing together fragments of a plan. Agnes thought she knew me, thought she knew what I was capable of. She saw a tired old man, a failure compared to Eldon's polished success. But there was strength in me, yet forged in the quiet sacrifices she'd never seen in the choices I'd made when she was too young to understand. The house settled around me, its creaks and sighs a familiar symphony. I dried my hands and walked to my office, a converted bedroom that held the relics of my former life. The desk drawer rattled as I opened it, revealing a folder I hadn't touched in years. Inside were the adoption papers, their edges yellowed, but the words still clear. Winfred and Lula Cruz, legal guardians of Agnes Marie, age 2. 33 years ago, I'd signed my name to a promise not of blood, but of something stronger. I'd chosen her sight unseen from a system that had already failed her. And in that choice lay a power she couldn't yet comprehend. I closed the folder, my fingers lingering on its surface. Sunday would be more than a Father's Day lunch. It would be a reckoning not just for Agnes, but for me. I'd spent 5 years fading into the background of her life, letting her redefine me as Mom's ex-husband. But I was more than that. I was the man who'd built her a treehouse, who'd bandaged her scraped knees, who'd loved her through every triumph and heartbreak. And if 3 hours was all I had, I'd use them to remind her of that truth. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10, its deep notes reverberating through the empty house. I should have gone to bed, but sleep felt like surrender. Instead, I returned to the living room, the zoo picture from Agnes's childhood still on the coffee table. Her gap-toothed grin stared back at me, her tiny hand clutching mine as we stood before the elephant enclosure. "You're my superhero, Daddy," she'd said that day, her voice bright with unwavering trust. I held the photo to the light, studying the child who'd once believed I could do anything. Somewhere beneath her polished exterior, that child still existed. And on Sunday I'd find her, or I'd lose her forever. The secret in my desk drawer hummed with possibility, a hidden card I wasn't ready to play yet. But its presence gave me strength, a quiet certainty that I wasn't as powerless as she thought. The night stretched on the house, whispering its secrets, as I planned my next move. Agnes thought she knew the story of our family, but she'd only seen the surface. Beneath it lay truths that could shift the ground beneath her feet, truths I'd guarded for decades. And when the moment came, I'd wield them not with anger, but with the steady resolve of a man who'd never stopped being her father. The photo album lay open in my lap, its pages heavy with more than just paper. The lamplight cast a soft glow over the faded images, each one a portal to a life I'd almost forgotten, one where I was more than a shadow in my daughter's world. The house around me was silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock counting down the hours until Sunday, until the 3-hour window Agnes had granted me. But tonight, I wasn't ready to face that deadline. Instead, I let the memories pull me under like a tide, dragging me back to a shore I could no longer reach. I turned the page, and there she was. Agnes at 7, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream, her small hand clutching mine as we stood before the elephant enclosure at the zoo. Her gap-toothed grin was wide, unguarded, her eyes bright with a trust that felt like a physical weight in my chest. "You're my superhero, Daddy," she'd declared that day. Her arms wrapped around my neck as I carried her through the parking lot, her laughter ringing like a bell. The strongest man in the world, she'd called me. And I'd believed her. For a moment, I'd believed I could be anything she needed. The memory was vivid, sharp enough to cut. I could still feel the warmth of her small body against my shoulder, the way her fingers tangled in my collar as she pointed at the baby elephant trumpeting in the distance. That day, I'd been her protector, her anchor, the man who could shield her from a world that had already shown her its cruelty. But there was a shadow in that memory, a detail I'd buried deep, one that flickered now like a spark in the dark. The stuffed rabbit she'd clung to that day, its fur worn thin, its button eyes loose from too many nights in her arms. It wasn't just a toy. It was a relic from a life before me, a life I'd chosen to rewrite when I signed those adoption papers. I closed my eyes, letting the image linger. 33 years ago, I'd walked into a sterile office with Lula, our hands clasped tightly, our hearts pounding with a mix of fear and hope. The social worker had handed us a file, a thin folder that held the story of a 2-year-old girl named Agnes Marie. No last name, no roots, just a child left adrift in a system that chewed up hope and spat out paperwork. Her birth parents were ghosts, their reasons for abandoning her lost to bureaucratic haze. But when I saw her photo, those wide, wary eyes, that tattered rabbit clutched against her chest, I knew. She was mine, not by blood, but by something stronger, a choice. I hadn't told her. Not then, not ever. Lula and I had agreed to keep the truth locked away, to let Agnes grow up believing she was ours in every way that mattered. It wasn't a lie, not really, just a truth we'd shaped to protect her. But now, as I sat in my empty living room, the weight of that secret felt like a stone in my pocket, pulling me toward a reckoning I wasn't sure I was ready for. I flipped to another photo, this one from Agnes's 10th birthday. She stood beside the treehouse I'd built in our old backyard, her grin fierce as she defended my ancient Honda to her classmates. "My dad's car is vintage," she'd declared, her chin jutted out like a tiny warrior. "It's got character." She'd inherited my stubborn streak, my refusal to bend when something mattered. I'd spent weeks on that treehouse hammering nails in the summer heat, my hands blistered but my heart full. Every splinter was worth it for the way she'd climbed to the top and declared it her castle, her kingdom, with me as her knight. But kingdoms fall. I turned the page again and the photos grew sparser, the smiles less certain. By 16, Agnes was rolling her eyes at my TED jokes, but she still laughed, her affection a quiet rebellion against teenage cynicism. She'd come to me with her troubles, boyfriends who didn't deserve her, college applications that loomed like mountains, dreams she wasn't sure she could reach. I was her sounding board, her safe harbor. "You always believe in me, Dad," she'd said one night, perched on my workbench in the garage, her voice soft with gratitude. Even when I don't believe in myself, I'd believed in her with a fierceness that surprised me, a love that felt like a physical force. But love, I'd learned, wasn't always enough. The next photo was from her college graduation, her cap tilted at a defiant angle, her smile bright but guarded. Lula and I flanked her, our arms around her waist, a family unit that still felt unbreakable. 2 years later, Lula was gone, remarried to Eldon, a man whose wealth and confidence cast a shadow I couldn't escape. 6 months after that, Agnes started calling him her bonus dad, a phrase that twisted in my gut like a rusted nail. I closed the album, the leather cool against my palms. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the weight of what I'd lost. 5 years ago, everything had changed. The engineering firm where I'd spent 4 decades let me go, their words clinical, their handshake cold. Downsizing, they called it, as if my life could be reduced to a spreadsheet entry. At 60, I was too old to start over, too young to retire. The severance lasted 8 months. 8 months of sending resumes into the void, of watching Lula drift further away, her patience evaporating like morning mist. She'd started working late, her excuses flimsy. Book club meetings that ran past midnight. Phone calls taken in hushed tones, her voice lighter, younger, as if she were shedding the weight of our shared life. When she told me about Eldon, it wasn't a surprise, just a confirmation of the emptiness I'd already felt. "He makes me feel like myself again," she'd said, her words a blade I hadn't seen coming. "He sees potential in me." Unlike me, apparently, the man who'd worked double shifts to put her through graduate school, who'd celebrated every milestone, every victory, as if they were my own. I stood the album slipping to the floor with a soft thud. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every thought, every regret. I walked to the kitchen where the coffee maker gurgled its rhythm, a hollow comfort. I poured a cup, the steam rising like a veil, and carried it to my office, a converted bedroom that held the relics of my former life. The desk drawer rattled as I opened it, revealing the folder I hadn't touched in years. The adoption papers stared back at me. Their edges yellowed their words, a silent vow. Winfred and Lula Cruz, legal guardians of Agnes Marie, age 2. I traced my signature, bold and confident, despite the fear I'd felt that day. We'd chosen her not because of blood, but because of a promise to be her family, to give her a home, a name, a life. That choice had defined me, shaped every decision I'd made since. But it was also a secret one I'd carried like a hidden blade, sharp and dangerous, waiting for the moment it might be needed. The memory of that day flooded back unbidden. The orphanage was a gray building, its walls stained with time and neglect. Agnes had been so small, her eyes too big for her face, her rabbit clutched like a shield. She didn't cry when we took her hand, but she didn't smile either, just watched us with a wariness that broke my heart. I'd knelt before her, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I'm Winfred," I'd said, "and I'm going to be your dad." She hadn't answered, but she'd let me lift her into my arms, her body light as a bird. That night, as she slept in her new room, Lula and I stood in the doorway watching her chest rise and fall. "We're her family now," Lula had whispered, her hand in mine. "No matter what, no matter what." Those words had carried us through fevers and nightmares, through school plays and teenage rebellions, through every moment of joy and pain. But they hadn't been enough to hold Lula to me or to keep Agnes from slipping away. I closed the folder, the papers rustling like whispers of a past I couldn't reclaim. The coffee had gone cold, a brown ring staining the desk where the mug had sweated. I stood and walked to Agnes's old room, the door creaking as I pushed it open. It was exactly as she'd left it 5 years ago, a time capsule of a girl who no longer existed. Her violin sat in the corner, its strings long silent. The desk where she'd done her homework was cluttered with faded stickers, a testament to her teenage obsessions. In the closet I found a shoebox filled with Father's Day cards. Their construction paper hearts brittle with age. Their crayon letters proclaiming me the best dad ever. I opened one, the handwriting wobbly but earnest. "Dear Daddy, you're my hero. Love, Agnes." She'd drawn a stick figure of me in a cape, a superhero who could fix anything. I'd been her hero then, her protector, her first and most important love. But heroes fall, and I'd fallen hard, first from Lula's heart, then from Agnes's. By the time she was 28, she was comparing my advice to Eldon's, his polished wisdom trumping my quiet encouragement. At 30, she'd asked me to contribute to her house down payment, only to mention that Eldon had already covered most of it. At 32, she'd called him more like a real father, a phrase that hit like a physical blow. I set the card down, my hands trembling. The memory of that moment was a wound that hadn't healed. I'd raised her from the age of 2, taught her to ride a bike, sat through every school play, stayed up nights when she had fevers or heartbreak. But in 3 short years, Eldon had become more real to her than the father who'd loved her unconditionally for 3 decades. His wealth, his connections, his effortless confidence. They were a currency I couldn't match. When Agnes graduated with her MBA, he'd thrown her a party at his country club. When she got promoted, he'd taken her to restaurants I couldn't pronounce, let alone afford. I'd offered what I could, homemade dinners, long walks, a steady presence that didn't photograph well for social media. But steady wasn't enough in a world that valued flash over substance. The change had accelerated after my job loss. Agnes's calls grew shorter, her visits perfunctory. She'd arrive for holiday dinners, her phone buzzing with messages from her bonus family about more exciting plans. I'd become the warm-up act, the obligation she squeezed in before the main event. And yet I couldn't let go. I couldn't stop loving her even as she drifted further into Eldon's orbit. I returned to the living room, the photo album still spread across the coffee table, like a map of my failures. But there was something else there too, a strength I hadn't acknowledged in years. I'd built a life for Agnes not out of obligation, but out of choice. I'd chosen her when she was a stranger, a scared child with no one else. And in that choice lay a power that Eldon's money could never touch. I picked up the zoo picture again, holding it to the light. Agnes's grin was a beacon, a reminder of the girl who'd once believed in me. But there was something in her eyes even then, a flicker of the wariness she'd carried from her first life, a shadow I'd spent years trying to erase. I'd succeeded for a while. But shadows have a way of returning, creeping into the cracks of even the strongest foundations. The grandfather clock chimed 11, its notes a warning that time was slipping away. Sunday was coming, and with it a chance to confront the distance between us. But there was more at stake than a single day. The secret in my desk drawer was a weapon, one I'd never wanted to wield. Yet as I stood in the quiet of my house, the weight of Agnes's dismissal pressing against me, I felt it stirring again, a truth that could either save us or destroy us. I walked to the window, the darkness outside reflecting my own uncertainty. The suburban street was still, the houses around me glowing with the warmth of families I could no longer claim. But I wasn't powerless. I'd built bridges once, literal and figurative, connecting people, places, lives. And I could build one more to reach the daughter who'd forgotten me. The question was whether she'd cross it or burn it down. The coffee cup sat untouched on the table, its contents cold and forgotten. I didn't need caffeine now. I needed clarity, the kind that comes from facing truths you've avoided for too long. Agnes thought she knew our story, thought she understood the man who'd raised her. But she didn't know the half of it. And on Sunday, when she walked through my door, I'd decide whether to keep the secret buried or let it rise like a storm that could wash everything clean or leave us in ruins. The morning light filtered through my office window, weak and gray, as if the sun itself were hesitant to witness my unraveling. I sat at my desk, the adoption papers hidden in their folder, a silent weight in the drawer to my left. The coffee I'd brewed sat cold beside my outdated computer, its screen flickering as it struggled to load my bank account. The numbers stared back at me, unyielding, $25,000. My entire savings scraped together over 5 years of disciplined sacrifice, every skipped meal, every mended shirt, every postponed dream distilled into that pitiful sum. And now Agnes wanted $100,000, a number so far beyond my reach, it felt like a taunt from a world that had already cast me aside. It was Saturday, 2 days before Father's Day, and the memory of Agnes's voice from yesterday still echoed in my head, sharp and urgent. She'd arrived unannounced, her silver Audi gleaming in my driveway like a polished accusation. I'd been in the back garden wrestling with a stubborn dandelion, my hands caked with soil, when I heard the car door slam. The sound jolted me, unexpected as thunder in a clear sky. Agnes never came early. She never came unannounced. Yet there she was, striding up my cracked concrete path in a sharp blazer, her heels clicking with military precision, a portfolio case tucked under her arm like a weapon. "Dad," she'd said, pausing at my front step, her eyes sweeping over my grass-stained knees and dirt-streaked hands. "We need to talk. Seriously." I'd fumbled with my house key, suddenly aware of how shabby my front door looked next to her polished exterior. "Of course, sweetheart," I'd replied, my voice betraying none of the unease coiling in my gut. "Come in, please." She'd settled on my living room couch, her movements efficient, almost clinical, as she opened her portfolio. Charts and graphs spilled across my coffee table like battle plans, their colors bright and aggressive under the lamplight. Her eyes sparked with an excitement I hadn't seen in years, a fire that reminded me of the girl who'd once dreamed of castles and conquests. "I've been developing something incredible, Dad," she said, pointing to a pie chart that screamed ambition. "A digital marketing consultancy for small businesses. Mom-and-pop shops, local services, family restaurants. They're all struggling with their online presence. The market is completely underserved." I leaned forward, genuinely intrigued, despite the knot of confusion tightening in my chest. "That sounds promising," I said, tracing the upward curve of her revenue projections. "You've always had a gift for seeing opportunities." "Exactly." She flipped to another page, her voice gaining momentum. "I've already got 3 potential clients lined up from preliminary conversations. Conservative estimates put me at 6 figures within 18 months. The numbers swam before my eyes: monthly recurring revenue, client acquisition costs, profit margins, a language of success that felt foreign to my engineer's mind, trained in steel and concrete, not digital dreams. "This is impressive, Agnes," I said, my finger lingering on the chart's upward trajectory. "Really impressive. But what does this have to do with I need $100,000 for my startup?" The words hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My coffee cup trembled in my hand, liquid sloshing against the rim. I set it down carefully, buying time to process the impossible sum. That's a significant investment." I managed, my voice steady, despite the chaos in my mind. She was already nodding, pulling out more documents with practiced efficiency. "Office lease for 2 years, professional equipment, initial marketing budget, legal fees for incorporation. It's all calculated down to the penny." Her tone was urgent, almost pleading. "Dad, I know it sounds like a lot, but this opportunity won't wait. There's another firm sniffing around the same market segment. If I don't move now, someone else will capture these clients." I stared at the papers, the numbers growing larger in the silence, expanding until they filled the room. "Have you approached banks?" "Business loans?" I asked, my practical side grasping for solutions while my heart reeled. "Banks want established revenue history. Collateral I don't have," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "You know how conservative they are with startups. But family investment is different. It's about believing in potential, not just spreadsheets." "Family investment," as if I were a Rockefeller, not a pensioned engineer with a modest savings account. "I've run every scenario, Dad." She continued, her voice a torrent now. "Break even by month 14, full profitability by month 20. These aren't fantasy numbers. They're based on real market research." I nodded, making encouraging sounds, but inside I was calculating with desperate precision. $100,000. My entire savings wouldn't cover a quarter of that. Even if I liquidated everything, sold the Honda, the furniture Lula left behind, the jewelry and the safe, I'd be lucky to scrape together $40,000. The math was brutal, unyielding, a cold equation that mocked my years of careful planning. "So what do you think?" Agnes sat back, her eyes bright with anticipation, as if she truly believed I could pull miracles from my threadbare pockets. I looked at her animated face, her careful charts, her trust that I'd come through despite everything, and felt the weight of her expectations press against my ribs. "I'll try to figure something out, sweetheart," I said, the words tasting like a promise I couldn't keep. Her smile could have powered the entire house. "I knew you'd come through, Dad. You always do." She gathered her papers with efficient movements, already moving on to the next step in her grand plan. "I'll need to know by Sunday, though. Monday at the latest. The office space won't stay available long. Sunday, Father's Day." The irony was a blade in my chest. "I understand," I said, helping her stack the papers, my hands moving automatically, while my mind scrambled for solutions that didn't exist. "Time-sensitive opportunities require quick decisions." She stood, smoothing her blazer. "Thanks, Dad. This means everything to me. Finally, I can prove what I'm capable of." I walked her to the door, watching her confident stride back to her car. She turned at the driver's door and waved, her face radiant with certainty that I'd make the impossible happen. The Audi disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing in my doorway, her business plan clutched in my dirt-stained hands. The afternoon sun was too bright, the suburban silence too complete. $100,000. I'd promised my daughter the moon when I could barely afford candles. I closed the door and walked to my office, the business plan heavier with each step. The house seemed to watch me, its creaks and sighs a chorus of doubt. My office, a converted bedroom, was a shrine to my diminished life stacks of financial statements, an outdated computer, a filing cabinet labeled banking that held my meager defenses against the world. The computer wheezed to life, each page load a slow march toward judgment. My primary checking account showed $3,047 monthly expense money budgeted to last until the next pension deposit. The savings account held $18,500, my pride and shield against emergencies. In the small safe behind my desk, $3,100 in cash for situations banks couldn't solve. Total liquid assets $24,647. Rounded up $25,000. A far cry from $100,000. I opened my retirement account next, the numbers glaring from the screen, $127,000. But it was a mirage. Early withdrawal penalties would devour nearly half, and I'd need to justify the hardship to the IRS. My calculator, worn smooth from years of engineering, clicked under my fingers as I ran numbers that refused to bend. Home equity may be $85,000, but selling would take months and leave me homeless. The Honda was worth $8,000 at best. Lula's leftover furniture might fetch a few thousand at an estate sale. Even liquidating everything, I'd fall short by a chasm. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight. The adoption papers in the drawer seemed to pulse, a silent reminder of the truth I'd kept hidden for 33 years. Agnes thought she knew me, thought she understood the limits of my world. But she didn't know the choices I'd made, the battles I'd fought to give her a life she could take for granted. That secret was my strength, my hidden card. But it wasn't money. And money was what she wanted now. I picked up the landline, its keypad worn from years of use. My contact list had shrunk since the divorce. Old colleagues scattered by layoffs, neighbors I barely knew, family with their own struggles. I dialed Jerry, my former colleague from the engineering firm, a man who'd shared 15 years of coffee breaks and deadlines before the downsizing tore us apart. His voice was cautious when he answered. "Winfred? Been a while. I know I said my throat tight. I need a favor, Jerry. A big one." I explained Agnes's plan, the $100,000 she needed, the impossible deadline. His silence was heavy, broken only by the nervous stirring of his coffee. "I'd help if I could," he said, finally avoiding my gaze through the phone. "But Sarah's medical bills last year wiped us out. I might manage $2,000, maybe $3,000 if I push it. $2,000, a teaspoon against an ocean. I appreciate it." I said, meaning it, though the number felt like a mockery of my need. We hung up and I dialed Mike, my college roommate, the best man at my wedding to Lula. His living room when I arrived an hour later was comfortable but not lavish, filled with photos of grandchildren I'd never met. Our friendship had faded after the divorce, another casualty of life's relentless reshuffling. $5,000, Mike said after I laid out Agnes's situation. "That's what I can manage, but it'll take 2 weeks to liquidate some investments without a hit." 2 weeks. Another impossible timeline. I wish I could do more, Winfred. That's a hell of a lot of money to raise quickly. He walked me to his car, shaking his head. "Have you considered she might start smaller, work her way up?" But Agnes wasn't thinking small. She was thinking like Eldon. Big dreams, aggressive timelines, success measured in 6 figures. I thanked Mike and drove home, the numbers swirling in my head like a storm. The antique shop was my last desperate stop, a corner store I'd passed 1,000 times without noticing. The air inside smelled of dust and forgotten stories, shelves crowded with other people's discarded treasures. The owner, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, examined Lula's jewelry box with clinical detachment. Cultured pearls, not natural, maybe $400. He moved to my father's watch collection, a handful of Timexes from the 70s. $600 if they work. The wedding china, the set Lula and I had used for our first Thanksgiving, sparked the most interest. Nearly $2,000 as a complete service for 12, he said. But holding those plates, I saw Lula arranging them, her smile bright with newlywed hope. Some prices were too high to pay. Total maybe $5,000 if you're patient, the owner said, gesturing at his cluttered shop. Immediate sale closer to 3. I left with nothing but a sinking certainty, even the maximum. Jerry's $2,000, Mike's $5,000, antiques at $5,000 left me 40,000 short. My driveway felt like a dead end as I pulled in the calculator in my hand, confirming the brutal math. Personal savings $25,000, possible loans $7,000, antique sales $5,000, total $37,000, still $63,000 short. I sat in my car, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stared at my house. It looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of my failure. The business plan sat on my coffee table inside its charts, mocking me with their promise of a future I couldn't afford. I'd promised Agnes I'd figure something out, but the truth was stark, I couldn't. Not with money. But there was another currency, one I'd held in reserve for decades. The truth about her origins, the adoption papers that could rewrite everything she thought she knew. I walked inside the house, settling around me with familiar creaks. The adoption papers were still in the drawer, their presence a quiet hum, like a storm gathering strength. I'd chosen Agnes once not because of blood, but because of love. That choice had given me strength through every loss, my job, my marriage, my place in her life. But now as Sunday loomed, I wondered if that strength would be enough. Agnes saw me as a shadow of Eldon, a man who could hand her 100,000 without blinking. She didn't know the battles I'd fought, the secrets I'd kept to protect her. I sat at my desk, the business plan open before me. Agnes's handwriting was meticulous, her ambition a mirror of the girl who'd once climbed my treehouse and declared it her kingdom. But kingdoms required resources, and I had none to give, none she valued at least. The phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Jerry. Can confirm $2,000. Wish I could do more. I stared at the message, the numbers blurring as my vision swam. $2,000. A gesture, not a solution. I stood and walked to the window. The suburban street dark and still. The secret in my drawer was a weapon, one I'd never wanted to use. But as I thought of Agnes's radiant smile, her certainty that I'd come through, I felt it stirring again, a truth that could either bridge the gap between us or widen it forever. Sunday would decide. Father's Day, a day meant for celebration, felt like a battlefield, now one where I'd face not just Agnes but the shadow of Eldon and the weight of my own limitations. I turned back to the desk, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest. I'd built bridges once, structures that defied gravity and time, and I could build one more even if it was made of truth rather than steel. The question was whether Agnes would cross it or burn it down. The morning of Father's Day broke with a deceptive calm, the sky a pale blue that promised warmth but delivered none. I stood in my kitchen, the scent of roasting herbs filling the air as I prepared the meal I'd planned for Agnes: garlic, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and the herb-crusted roast she'd loved as a child. The good china the set Lula had left behind gleamed on the dining room table set for two, with a precision that belied the chaos in my heart. 3 hours. That's what Agnes had promised me, 3 hours to bridge the chasm that had grown between us, to remind her of the father I'd been before Eldon's shadow eclipsed me. I'd spent Saturday night sleepless, haunted by the $100,000 demand I couldn't meet. My savings, my friends' offers, the paltry sum I could scrape from selling antiques, they were drops in a bucket that needed an ocean. But I'd pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on this meal, this moment. If I couldn't give Agnes the money she wanted, I could give her this, a taste of the past, a reminder of who we'd been together. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked toward noon, each chime a countdown to her arrival. I adjusted the table settings one last time, smoothing the tablecloth, as if perfection could ward off the inevitable. The doorbell rang at exactly noon, sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet like a blade. I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel, my heart lifting despite itself. At least she was on time. At least she was here. I forced a smile, rehearsing the words I'd use to explain my financial failure, to make her see that love was worth more than money. But when I opened the door, the world tilted beneath my feet. Three figures stood on my doorstep, not one. Agnes stood in the center, her smile bright but brittle, her eyes flickering with something I couldn't name, guilt, perhaps, or defiance. Flanking her were Lula, my ex-wife, and Eldon, the man who'd claimed my place in her heart. Lula's gaze darted away, her discomfort palpable, her hands clutching her purse like a shield. Eldon, tall and impeccably dressed, surveyed my modest porch with the appraising eye of a conqueror inspecting new territory. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of their intrusion. Surprised Dad, Agnes's voice was too cheerful a forced note that grated against the silence. "I brought Mom and Eldon." I stumbled back a step, my hand gripping the doorframe to steady myself. The carefully planned day, my 3 hours, my chance to reconnect, dissolved into a nightmare. "Hi, Winfred," Lula said, her voice laced with artificial brightness. "I hope you don't mind." Eldon stepped forward without invitation, his polished shoes clicking against my worn floorboards. "Interesting little place," he said, his gaze sweeping my hallway. "Very cozy." The word was a blade diminishing my home to a child's playhouse, a relic unfit for a man of his stature. "Of course not," I heard myself say, muscle memory of politeness overriding the shock. "Please come in." The words tasted like surrender as they filed past me, their presence filling the living room with a suffocating weight. Agnes twirled in the center of the room, her arms spread wide as if this were a celebration rather than an invasion. "Isn't this perfect, all my family together for Father's Day? All my family." The phrase cut deeper than she could know, relegating me to a supporting role in a story I'd written with 33 years of love. Lula perched on the edge of the sofa, her purse still clutched in her lap, her eyes avoiding mine. Eldon, with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered, settled into my armchair, his fingers brushing the leather as if claiming it. He adjusted a picture frame on the side table, a photo of Agnes and me at her high school graduation, his touch proprietary, as if my memories were his to rearrange. "Your father's made this place very nice," Lula said. Her voice strained, her words a weak attempt at diplomacy. "Very comfortable." Another diminishing adjective, as if my home were a compromise, a settling for less. "I thought this would be good for everyone," Agnes continued, oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. "You know, family bonding, getting to know each other better. Getting to know each other." As if Eldon and I were strangers meeting for coffee, not rivals for her affection, not a father and the man who'd stolen his place. I retreated to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I calculated frantically. The roast could stretch to feed 4 if I carved it thin. The vegetables might suffice barely. I pulled extra plates from the cabinet, the clatter of porcelain masking the tremor in my fingers. My intimate meal for 2 had morphed into an improvised dinner party, a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. "Need any help in there?" Agnes called, her voice bright but distant, as if she were already halfway out the door. No, everything's under control." I lied, though nothing was. My day, my plan, my dignity, all hijacked by this surprise invasion. Through the kitchen doorway I caught glimpses of Eldon examining my bookshelf, pulling out volumes, and reading their spines with the thoroughness of an appraiser valuing an estate. He'd moved my favorite lamp to a different table, claiming the prime spot by the window without a word. Lula made small talk about the neighborhood, her voice artificially bright. "Have they finished that construction on Maple Street?" It was such a mess when I drove through. Past tense, as if this were no longer her world, no longer her home. I carried drinks into the living room on a tray that rattled in my unsteady hands. Eldon had made himself at home, his feet propped on my coffee table, the television remote in his hand, though he hadn't turned it on. "This roast smells wonderful," Lula said, accepting her glass with fingers that avoided mine. You always did know your way around a kitchen. Agnes bounced between her mother and Eldon, playing translator at a diplomatic summit, ensuring everyone was comfortable, everyone was happy, everyone except the man whose home they'd invaded. The dining room's just through here, I announced, gesturing toward the doorway. Everything should be ready. As they filed past, Agnes grabbed my arm and squeezed her touch, fleeting but warm. "Thank you for being so gracious about this, Dad," she said. "I know surprises aren't your thing, but I thought it would be wonderful to have everyone together." Wonderful for whom I wanted to ask, but her face glowed with such satisfaction that I could only nod and follow my uninvited guests into the dining room. The space I'd set so carefully for two now felt pathetically inadequate for four. I hurried to add place settings, the mismatched chairs and cramped quarters, shouting my bachelor inadequacy. Eldon claimed the head of the table, my usual spot, without hesitation, settling in with the ease of a king. Agnes slid into the chair beside him, naturally gravitating to his orbit. Lula took the seat opposite, leaving me at the foot of my own table, a demotion as clear as the hierarchy it established. The air was thick with unspoken tensions, a storm brewing beneath the surface of polite conversation. I served the roast, my hands steady, despite the turmoil within, carving thin slices to stretch the meal. Eldon's fork dissected the meat with surgical precision, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Turkey's a bit dry," he said, his tone casual but cutting. "Not bad for home cooking, though. Most people overcook it without proper equipment." "I managed fine," I replied, the words sharper than intended. "Got used to it over the years." Agnes shot me a warning look, her knife pausing mid-cut. I focused on spooning cranberry sauce, my hands itching to tremble. "Curious how you manage such a big house alone?" Eldon continued, his gaze sweeping the dining room with an appraiser's eye. "Must be quite the challenge, maintenance-wise." "It's not that big," I said carefully, my voice a tightrope. "Just right for one person. Still all those rooms to heat and winter property taxes on a place this size." He gestured at my crown molding, likely calculating square footage. "Economic efficiency would suggest something more compact." Agnes laughed, the sound sharp in the confined space. "Eldon's always thinking about optimization. It's what makes him so successful in business." Successful in business. Unlike her father, the implication hung in the air like a noose. Lula attempted a rescue, her voice desperate with cheer. "The neighborhood's really maintained its character, though. Those oak trees must be 60 years old." "Mature landscaping adds value," Eldon agreed, his tone authoritative. "Though I noticed the gutters could use attention, and that front step has a crack developing." Every observation was a small blade precisely placed, each one cataloging my decline. My house wasn't just a home. It was evidence of failure of a man unable to maintain what he'd built. I focused on carving more roast, the knife heavy in my hand, each slice a reminder of the meal I'd prepared with such care, now being consumed by people inventorying my shortcomings. "Dad always makes the best holiday meals," Agnes said, her voice lacking conviction. "Remember that Christmas stuffing, Mom, with the chestnuts?" "That was wonderful," Lula agreed quickly, too quickly. "You always put so much thought into the details." "Details matter," Eldon observed, reaching across me for the salt without asking. "Though sometimes it's more efficient to delegate. Professional catering, for instance, saves time for more important things." More important things. The implication was clear. A father cooking for his daughter was a trivial act compared to the grand gestures Eldon could afford. Agnes checked her phone, then looked around the table with a satisfied smile. "This is exactly what I hoped for," she said. "All my parents together sharing a meal. All my parents." The phrase completed my demotion, reducing me to a member of a committee, rather than the man who'd raised her. I swallowed the hurt, my throat tight, and forced a smile. "Wine would complement this nicely," Eldon noted, examining his water glass with mild disapproval. "Perhaps a nice Pinot Noir." We brought back an excellent bottle from Sonoma. We, their shared experiences, their coupled pronouns, their joint ownership of a world I could no longer enter. I'm not much of a wine drinker, I admitted, though I'd enjoyed wine during my marriage. Financial constraints had turned it into a luxury I couldn't afford. Shame, Eldon said, his smile devoid of warmth. A good wine education opens doors, business dinners, client entertainment, social connections. Essential in today's market. Today's market. A world where I was a relic, outdated, as my engineering tools irrelevant in the face of his polished success. The conversation flowed around me, through me, including me only as a courtesy. Agnes grew animated, discussing her work, her plans, her bright future supported by people who understood the modern world. Eldon nodded approvingly, his comments laced with authority, while Lula offered polite affirmations, her eyes flickering to me with something like pity. I sat at the foot of my own table, a silent observer. In a play I hadn't written, my role reduced to that of a prop. The phone in my pocket buzzed, a faint vibration I ignored. It was probably Jerry, my old colleague, following up on his $2,000 offer, a drop in the ocean of Agnes's $100,000 demand. I couldn't step away now, couldn't abandon my post while Eldon catalogued my domestic failures. The dessert, store-bought pie and coffee loomed as the next act in this farce. But I sensed something else coming, something heavier. Agnes's smile, her insistence on staying longer, held a purpose I couldn't yet see, a calculation that made my skin prickle. I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of checking the pie, needing a moment to breathe. The adoption papers locked in my office drawer seemed to hum with a life of their own, a secret that could shift the ground beneath this fragile gathering. I'd kept it hidden for 33 years, a shield as much as a burden, but its weight was growing, pressing against my resolve. Agnes thought she knew me, thought she understood the limits of my world. But she didn't know the truth. I'd carried the choice that had defined us both. As I returned to the dining room carrying a tray of coffee cups, I caught Eldon examining my spice rack, opening jars, with the casual entitlement of a man who owned everything he touched. Lula hovered nearby, her expression torn between stopping him and avoiding conflict. Agnes watched them with a smile, as if this were the family she'd always wanted. But I saw the cracks beneath her performance, the flicker of unease in her eyes when they met mine. She hadn't mentioned the $100,000 yet, hadn't brought up the business plan in front of Eldon and Lula. That conversation was coming, and when it did, it would expose my failure in front of the man who'd already taken so much. I set the tray down, the cups clinking softly. "Coffee's almost ready," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. Agnes nodded, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "We should stay a bit longer," she said, settling back into her chair beside Eldon. "Make this a real family afternoon." The meaningful glance she exchanged with Eldon sent a chill through me. This wasn't spontaneous hospitality. It was orchestrated, a prelude to something I couldn't yet name. Eldon reached into his jacket pocket with theatrical precision, his fingers closing around something that made him smile. The gesture was deliberate, ceremonial, like a magician preparing his final trick. My heart pounded, a drumbeat warning of a blow I couldn't see coming. "Actually, Agnes," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "before we get too comfortable, I have something for you." He withdrew a folded check, its crisp edges gleaming in the light, and placed it on my table right beside the coffee stain that had spread across the cloth. Even upside down, I could see the amount written in his confident handwriting, $100,000. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the promise of betrayal. Agnes's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth in a gasp that was both genuine and rehearsed. She hadn't known this was coming, but she'd set the stage for it, bringing Eldon here, turning my Father's Day into his performance. The check lay there, a silent challenge, a symbol of everything I couldn't give her. And in that moment I felt the secret in my drawer stir again, a shadow rising from the depths ready to claim its place in this unfolding drama. I stood frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table as the truth I'd guarded for decades whispered its power. This wasn't just about money, it was about who Agnes thought I was, who she thought Eldon was. And when the moment came, I'd decide whether to wield that truth like a sword or let it lie dormant, a secret that could either save us or shatter us forever. The dining room was a battlefield, the air thick with the scent of roasted herbs and unspoken betrayals. Eldon's check lay on my table like a gauntlet thrown, its crisp edges gleaming under the chandelier's weak light. $100,000. The number was a taunt, a cold calculation of my failure written in his bold, confident script. Agnes's gasp lingered in the silence, her hand frozen over her mouth, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and something else, triumph perhaps, or relief. Lula sat rigid, her fingers clutching her coffee cup, her gaze darting between the check and me as if she could sense the storm about to break. And Winfred stood at the foot of my own table, my hands gripping the edge, my world teetering on the brink of collapse. "Eldon, you didn't," Agnes whispered, her voice trembling with a joy that cut me deeper than any knife. She reached for the check, her fingers brushing its surface, as if it were a sacred relic. This is everything. Consider it an investment in your future." Eldon said, his voice smooth as polished marble, his smile a blade veiled in kindness. "A real father steps up when it matters, Agnes. You deserve someone who can make your dreams happen, not just wish for them." His eyes flicked to me, brief but deliberate, a challenge that landed like a blow. A real father. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, slicing through 33 years of love and sacrifice. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the room tilting as if the house itself were rejecting me. My fingers tightened on the table, the wood biting into my palms, anchoring me against the rising tide of hurt. Agnes's gaze met mine, her expression a mix of gratitude and apology, but there was no mistaking the spark in her eyes. She was looking at Eldon, not me, as the hero of her story. "Thank you," she said to him, her voice thick with emotion. "This means I can start right away. The office, the equipment, everything." I opened my mouth to speak, to confess the truth I'd been wrestling with since her demand yesterday. The $25,000 I'd scraped together, the pitiful sum that was all I had. But before I could, Eldon leaned back in his chair, my chair, his posture radiating ownership. "You're going to do great things, Agnes," he said. "With the right support, there's no limit to what you can achieve." The right support. The implication was clear. I was not that support. I was the man who'd failed her, the shadow to Eldon's son. Lula cleared her throat, her voice thin and strained. "Winfred, the roast was lovely. You've outdone yourself. A weak attempt at redirection, a bandage on a wound too deep to heal with pleasantries." I nodded, my throat tight, unable to muster a response. The coffee cups sat untouched, the pie. Forgotten the meal I'd poured my heart into, reduced to a backdrop for Eldon's grand gesture. Agnes clutched the check, her eyes shining with a vision I couldn't share. "Dad," she said, turning to me, her tone suddenly earnest. "I know I asked you for the money and I appreciate you trying, but—" She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the table, the apology in her voice overshadowed by certainty. "Eldon's made it possible. This is my chance to build something real. Something real." The phrase was a dagger twisting in the space where my heart had been. For 33 years, I'd built something real: her life, her confidence, her dreams. I'd bandaged her knees, cheered at her recitals, stayed up nights when she cried over boys who didn't deserve her. But in this moment, I was nothing. A footnote in her success story, erased by a man with a checkbook. "I tried, Agnes," I said, my voice low, the words scraping against the raw edges of my pride. "I looked at everything, my savings, loans, selling what I could. I've got $25,000. That's all I can manage." The confession was a weight lifted, but it landed wrong, heavy and inadequate in the face of Eldon's $100,000. Agnes's face froze, her smile faltering as if I'd dropped a stone into her carefully constructed world. Then, to my horror, she laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed through the room like breaking glass. $25,000, she repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. Dad, that's nothing. That won't even cover the office lease for a year. The laughter cut deeper than words could, stripping away the last vestiges of my dignity. I stood there exposed, my failure laid bare before the man who'd replaced me and the woman who'd left me. I did everything I could. I said, my voice steady, despite the tremor in my chest. I called friends, checked accounts, went to the antique shop. That's what I have. Her laughter died, replaced by a flash of anger that stunned me. Everything you could, she snapped, standing now, her chair scraping against the floor. Dad, you don't get it. This is my future, my chance to be someone. And you're offering me pocket change. Eldon sees what I can do. He believes in me. Why can't you? The accusation was a physical blow, stealing my breath. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her about the nights I'd gone without dinner to save for her college, the double shifts I'd worked to keep our family afloat. But before I could, her hand lashed out a swift, shocking motion that ended with a crack against my cheek. The slap echoed in the silent room, a sound so sharp it seemed to freeze time. My face stung, but the pain was nothing compared to the wound in my heart. You're not my real father. Agnes spat, her voice venomous, her eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen. You're just Mom's ex-husband, clinging to a life you can't afford. Eldon's the one who acts like a father, who makes things happen. You're nothing compared to him. The words were a blade slicing through 33 years of love, reducing me to a stranger in my own home. Lula gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Eldon's smile didn't waver, but there was a glint in his eyes, a satisfaction that made my blood run cold. I stood frozen, my cheek burning, my vision blurring, as the room spun around me. Agnes's words echoed in my mind, each syllable, a hammer against the foundation of who I was. And then something shifted. The pain, the betrayal, the weight of her rejection. It unlocked a door I'd kept sealed for decades. The secret in my desk drawer, the truth I'd guarded since Agnes was 2 years old, surged to the surface, a force too powerful to contain. I straightened, my hands steady, now my voice calm despite the storm raging within. Agnes, I said, my tone low and deliberate, cutting through the charged silence. You don't know what you're saying. She froze, her anger faltering at the steel in my voice. Lula's eyes darted to me, a flicker of recognition, as if she sensed what was coming. Eldon leaned forward, his curiosity piqued, his confidence unshaken. But I wasn't speaking to him. This was for Agnes, for the daughter I'd chosen, for the truth that could either save us or destroy us. I've given you everything, I continued, my words measured, each one a stone in a wall. I was building between her anger and my heart. Not money, not checks, but a life, a home, a name. And you stand here in my house calling a man who's known you for 3 years your real father. You don't know what real means. Agnes's eyes narrowed, her hands clenching into fists. What are you talking about? You're not making sense. I took a step toward her, my gaze locked on hers, unflinching. The secret was no longer a shadow, it was a flame, burning away the fear that had kept it hidden. You think Eldon's your father because he can buy your dreams, I said, my voice rising now, carrying the weight of 33 years. You think I'm nothing because I can't match his money. Then let me tell you something, Agnes. Something you should have known a long time ago. Lula stood, her chair scraping against the floor, her voice urgent. Winfred, don't. But I was done holding back. The adoption papers locked in my office were more than documents. They were a testament to a choice that had defined my life. I'd kept them hidden to protect her, to give her a family without the burden of questions. But now that protection was a chain, and I was ready to break it. Agnes, I said, my voice steady as bedrock. You're not my biological daughter. You're not Lula's either. We adopted you when you were 2 from an orphanage that was more cage than home. You came to us with nothing but a stuffed rabbit and a name, Agnes Marie. No parents, no history, just a child who needed someone to choose her. And I did. I chose you. The room went still, the air heavy with the weight of truth. Agnes's face drained of color, her mouth open but silent, her eyes searching mine for a lie that wasn't there. Lula sank back into her chair, tears spilling down her cheeks, her hands trembling. Eldon's smile faltered, his confidence cracking for the first time, as if he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. "You're lying," Agnes whispered, but her voice lacked conviction, her anger crumbling under the weight of my words. "You're just saying this to hurt me. I'm saying this because you need to know." I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. "For 33 years, I've been your father not because of blood, but because I chose to love you. I built you a treehouse. I taught you to ride a bike. I stayed up nights when you were sick, when you were heartbroken, when you needed someone to believe in you. That's what a real father does. Not write checks, not buy loyalty. Love you even when it hurts." Agnes staggered back, her hand gripping the edge of the table, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The check lay forgotten between us, its promise of wealth meaningless in the face of this revelation. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking, her eyes filling with tears. "Why did you lie?" "It wasn't a lie," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "It was a choice. We wanted you to feel like you belonged, like you were ours." "And you were. You are." I took a step closer, my hand outstretched, but she flinched away, her face a storm of confusion and pain. Lula spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "He's telling the truth, Agnes. We adopted you because we loved you. Winfred, he was the one who insisted. He saw your picture and said, 'She's ours.' He's been your father in every way that matters." Agnes shook her head, her tears falling now, each one a shard of the life she thought she knew. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small, childlike. "If I'm not, then who am I?" "You're Agnes Marie," I said, my voice a lifeline in the chaos. "You're the girl who climbed my treehouse, who laughed at my terrible jokes, who made me prouder than I've ever been. You're my daughter not because of blood, but because I chose you every day for 33 years. The silence that followed was deafening, a void filled with the wreckage of our family. Eldon sat back, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. But I could see the cracks in his armor, the realization that his money couldn't buy what I'd given her. Lula wiped her eyes, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And Agnes, my Agnes, stood there, her world shattered, her anger replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her into my arms, as I had when she was a child, but I held back, giving her space to process the truth. The secret I'd carried for decades was out of force unleashed that could either heal us or break us beyond repair. I'd taken the risk not out of anger but out of love, a love that had survived every loss, every rejection, every moment of doubt. Agnes sank into her chair, her hands covering her face, her shoulders trembling. The check lay untouched, a symbol of a power that had failed to define her. I stood at the foot of my table, my cheek still stinging from her slap, my heart heavy with the weight of what I'd done. But there was a strength in me now, a clarity forged in the fire of this moment. I'd built bridges once, structures that defied gravity and time. And I'd build one more, even if it was made of truth rather than steel. The grandfather clock chimed its notes, a solemn reminder that time was moving forward, carrying us toward an uncertain future. I didn't know if Agnes would forgive me, if she'd ever see me as her father again. But I'd spoken my truth, and in doing so I'd reclaimed a piece of myself, the man who'd chosen her, who'd loved her, who'd never stopped being her father no matter what she called me. The silence in my dining room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the walls, as if the house itself held its breath. Agnes sat slumped in her chair, her hands covering her face, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. The check from Eldon lay untouched on the table, its $100,000 promise now a hollow artifact in the wake of the truth I'd unleashed. Lula's eyes glistened with tears. Her coffee cup abandoned her hands knotted in her lap as if to anchor herself against the storm I'd summoned. Eldon, for once, was still his polished confidence, cracked his gaze fixed on the table, as if the answers to this moment lay in its worn grain. And I stood at the foot of my own table, my cheek still burning from Agnes's slap, my heart pounding with the weight of the secret I'd carried for 33 years. The grandfather clock chimed its notes, a solemn toll marking the unraveling of the life Agnes thought she knew. I'd spoken the truth not out of anger but out of necessity, a blade I'd wielded to cut through her betrayal, to remind her who I was. She wasn't my biological daughter, nor Lula's. We'd adopted her at 2, chosen her from a system that had already discarded her, given her a name and a home when she had none. And now that truth hung between us, a force as powerful as any magic, reshaping the air we breathed. Agnes's hands fell from her face, revealing eyes red with tears, wide with a confusion that bordered on fear. "How could you not tell me?" she whispered, her voice raw, barely audible. "All these years. You let me believe." She trailed off her gaze, darting to Lula, then to me, searching for a lie that wasn't there. "Who am I?" "You're Agnes Marie," I said, my voice steady, a lifeline thrown across the chasm between us. "You're the girl who climbed my treehouse, who laughed at my terrible jokes, who made me prouder than I've ever been. You're my daughter, not because of blood, but because I chose you every day for 33 years. Her lips trembled, a sob breaking free as she shook her head. "But you lied. You and Mom both lied. You let me think I was yours, that I belonged." "You do belong," I said, taking a step closer, my hand outstretched but hesitant, afraid she'd flinch again. "Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. Sacrifice does. I chose you when you were a stranger, a scared little girl with a stuffed rabbit, and no one else in the world. That choice was real. It's always been real." Lula's voice broke through, trembling but resolute. "He's right, Agnes. We both chose you. Winfred saw your picture in that orphanage file, and he didn't hesitate. He said, 'She's ours.' He was the one who carried you home, who stayed up nights when you had nightmares, who built you that treehouse. He's been your father in every way that matters." Agnes's gaze snapped to Lula, her eyes blazing with a mix of betrayal and desperation. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why keep it a secret? Were you ashamed of me?" "No," Lula said, her voice cracking as she stood, her hands reaching for Agnes but stopping short. "Never ashamed. We wanted you to feel whole, to never doubt your place with us. We thought it was the right thing." "The right thing," Agnes's voice rose, sharp and jagged, cutting through the room. "You let me grow up thinking I was your daughter, and now I find out I'm— what? A charity case. A project." Her words were a lash, each one striking at the foundation of our family. She turned to me, her eyes searching mine, pleading for something to anchor her. Who were my real parents? Where did I come from? I took a deep breath, the weight of her question pressing against my chest. The truth was a double-edged sword, and I'd only revealed half of it. The orphanage file had been sparse, a few typed pages that offered little beyond her name and age. Her birth parents were shadows, their identities lost to a system that valued paperwork over people. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice steady despite the ache. The file didn't say. "Your birth parents, they left you at the orphanage when you were too young to remember. All you had was that rabbit, the one you carried everywhere." Her hand flew to her chest as if she could still feel the worn fur of that stuffed toy, now packed away in her old room. "The rabbit," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought you gave it to me." "I didn't," I said, my voice soft but firm. "It was yours before we met. It was all you had when we found you. And I swore I'd give you more, a home, a family, a life. I've spent 33 years keeping that promise." Her tears fell freely now, her shoulders shaking, as she sank back into her chair. The check lay forgotten, its promise of wealth meaningless in the face of this revelation. Eldon shifted uncomfortably, his hands folded, his silence, a stark contrast to his earlier confidence. For the first time he seemed out of place, a man who'd underestimated the power of the truth I'd unleashed. "Why now?" Agnes asked, her voice small childlike. "Why tell me now, after all this time?" I looked at the daughter I'd loved, through every joy and pain, and felt the weight of her slap still burning on my cheek. "Because you called me nothing," I said, my voice low, carrying the weight of 33 years. "You called Eldon your real father, as if everything I've done, everything I've given was meaningless. I couldn't let you believe that. Not anymore." Her eyes widened, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "I didn't mean—" She trailed off, her voice breaking as she looked at the check, then at Eldon, then back at me. "I was angry. I didn't know." "I know," I said, my tone softening. "And I'm not angry with you, Agnes. I'm hurt, but I'm not angry. I've loved you every day of your life, and that hasn't changed. It never will. But you needed to know the truth to understand what it means to be my daughter." Lula stepped forward, her tears falling now, her voice thick with emotion. "We should have told you sooner," she said. "That was my mistake too. But Winfred, he's been your rock, Agnes. Even when I left, when everything fell apart, he never stopped being your father." Agnes's gaze darted between us, her world unraveling with each word. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the weight of our shared history. Eldon cleared his throat, his voice careful, measured. "This is a lot to process," he said, his tone lacking its usual authority. "Perhaps we should give Agnes some space." "Space?" Agnes snapped, her voice sharp with sudden anger. "You don't get to decide what I need right now." She turned to me, her eyes searching, desperate. "You chose me," she said, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to, but you did." "Why?" The question was a knife cutting to the core of who I was. I thought of that day in the orphanage, the gray walls, the scared little girl with the rabbit clutched tight. I thought of the nights I'd rocked her to sleep, the days I'd spent building her treehouse, the years I'd poured into giving her a life she could be proud of. "Because you were worth choosing," I said, my voice steady, a vow renewed. "Because I looked at you and saw my daughter, not a stranger. Because love isn't about blood, it's about showing up every day, no matter what." Her sobs broke free, raw and unguarded, as she buried her face in her hands. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her into my arms as I had when she was a child, but I held back, giving her the space to feel the weight of my words. The truth was out of force that had reshaped our family in a single moment, and I didn't know if it would heal us or break us further. Eldon stood, his movements stiff, his confidence eroded. "I think we should go," he said, his voice quiet, almost chastened. He reached for the check, but Agnes's hand shot out, stopping him. "No," she said, her voice firm despite her tears. "I don't want it." His eyes widened, a flicker of surprise breaking through his composure. "Agnes, this is your future. My future isn't something you can buy," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Not anymore." She pushed the check toward him, her fingers trembling but resolute. "You thought you could just step in, be the hero, but you don't know what it means to be a father. Not like he does." The words were a balm to my wounded heart, a spark of hope in the darkness. I stood silent, my hands at my sides, my cheek still stinging from her slap, but my soul lighter than it had been in years. Agnes turned to me, her eyes red but clear, her voice steady now. "I'm sorry, Dad." She said the word Dad carrying a weight it hadn't in years. "I didn't know, I didn't understand. I know," I said, my voice soft, a bridge offered across the chasm between us. "But you do now." She nodded, her tears falling freely, her hands reaching for mine. I took them, her fingers warm and trembling, and for the first time in years I felt her, the real Agnes, the girl who'd once called me her superhero, not the polished stranger who'd drifted into Eldon's orbit. The room seemed to expand, the air lighter, as if the truth had lifted a burden we'd all carried too long. Lula stepped forward, her hand resting on Agnes's shoulder, her eyes meeting mine with a mix of gratitude and regret. "We should have done this differently," she said. "I should have been braver. We did what we thought was right," I said, my voice steady. "And we gave her a family. That's what matters." Eldon gathered his coat, his movements awkward, a man out of place in a moment he couldn't control. "I'll wait in the car," he said, his voice subdued, and for the first time I saw him not as a rival, but as a man who'd misjudged the power of love over money. He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Agnes stood, her hands still in mine, her eyes searching my face. "I need time," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "To understand this, to understand me." "Take all the time you need," I said, squeezing her hands gently. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, a small, fragile smile breaking through her tears. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, and the word was a gift, a reclamation of the bond we'd nearly lost. She turned to Lula, her expression softening. "I'm not angry with you, Mom. I need to figure this out." Lula nodded, her tears falling anew. "We'll figure it out together," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As they prepared to leave, Agnes paused at the dining room doorway, her gaze lingering on the table, the check still lying there like a discarded relic. "I don't need that," she said, more to herself than to us. "I'll start smaller, build it myself." I watched her go, my heart heavy but hopeful, the sting of her slap fading in the warmth of her apology. The house settled around me, its creaks and sighs a familiar comfort, now no longer a chorus of doubt. The truth was out, a force that had shaken us to our core, but left us standing not broken. I'd built bridges once, structures that defied gravity and time. And today I'd built one more, not with steel, but with the truth, a bridge that Agnes could cross when she was ready. The grandfather clock chimed again, marking the passage of a day that had changed everything. I stood alone in my dining room, the plates still scattered, the coffee cold, but the weight in my chest was lighter now. The secret I'd carried for 33 years was no longer a burden. It was a gift, a testament to the love that had defined me as a father. And as I looked at the empty doorway, I knew that Agnes, my daughter, would find her way back to me. The dining room was quiet now, the storm of truth having passed, leaving behind a fragile stillness. The check from Eldon lay abandoned on the table, its $100,000 promise, a forgotten relic in the wake of the revelation that had reshaped our world. Agnes stood in the doorway, her hands still trembling from the weight of her tears, her eyes red but steady as they met mine. Lula lingered beside her, her own face streaked with the remnants of regret, her hand resting lightly on Agnes's shoulder, as if to anchor her. Eldon was gone, his polished confidence reduced to a quiet retreat, his footsteps fading into the night as he waited in the car. And I, Winfred, stood at the heart of my home, my cheek still tingling from Agnes's slap, but my heart lighter than it had been in years. The grandfather clock chimed softly its notes, a gentle reminder that time, though relentless, could also heal. Agnes's apology hung in the air, her whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad, a fragile thread stitching us back together." I looked at her, my daughter, not by blood, but by choice, and saw the girl who'd once called me her superhero, the girl I'd chosen, in a gray orphanage 33 years ago. The secret I'd carried, the truth of her adoption, was no longer a shadow lurking in my desk drawer. It was a flame burning away the lies and misunderstandings, illuminating the love that had always bound us. "I don't know how to do this," Agnes said, her voice small but resolute, her hands twisting together as she stepped back into the dining room. "I don't know how to process this. That you're not." She trailed off, her eyes searching mine for answers I couldn't fully give. "You don't have to process it all now," I said, my voice steady, a bridge offered across the chasm of her confusion. "You just need to know that you're my daughter, Agnes. You always have been. That's never changed, and it never will." She nodded, her tears falling anew, but there was a spark in her eyes now, a flicker of the girl who'd once climbed my treehouse and declared it her kingdom. I was so angry, she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. When I asked for the money when I saw Eldon's check, I thought you didn't care. I thought you didn't believe in me. I've always believed in you," I said, taking a step closer, my hands aching to reach for her but giving her space. "Every day of your life. When you graduated, when you got your first job, when you told me about this business plan. I couldn't give you $100,000, but I gave you everything I had. And I'd do it again." Her lips trembled, a sob breaking free as she crossed the room in a rush, her arms wrapping around me in a hug that felt like coming home. I held her tightly, her head tucked against my shoulder, her tears soaking my shirt as they had when she was a child, scraped knees replaced by a deeper kind of hurt. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she said, her voice muffled against me. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." I know, I murmured, stroking her hair, the familiar gesture grounding me in a moment I'd feared I'd never have again. "You don't have to apologize. You just needed to know the truth." Lula stepped forward, her own tears falling as she watched us, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. "I should have been braver," she said, her voice thick with regret. "I should have told you years ago, Agnes. But we thought it was better this way." Agnes pulled back slightly, her hands still gripping my arms, her eyes shifting to Lula. "I'm not angry with you, Mom," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. I need time to understand who I am." "You're you," I said, my voice firm, a vow renewed. "You're Agnes Marie, the girl who made me a father. Nothing changes that, not a piece of paper, not a check, not anything." She nodded, a small, fragile smile breaking through her tears. "I want to know more," she said, her voice gaining strength. "About the orphanage, about where I came from, but not today. Today I just want to be here, with you." The words were a gift, a reclamation of the bond we'd nearly lost. I squeezed her hands, my heart swelling with a hope I hadn't dared to feel in years. "Then stay," I said, gesturing to the table, the cold coffee, the untouched pie. "Let's have dessert. Let's be a family." Lula hesitated, her gaze flickering to the door where Eldon waited. "I should go," she said, her voice soft but resolute. This is for you two." Agnes nodded, her hand reaching for Lula's, a brief touch that spoke of forgiveness, if not full understanding. "Thank you, Mom," she said, "for telling me now." Lula's tears fell anew as she hugged Agnes tightly, her shoulders shaking. "I love you," she whispered, then turned to me, her eyes meeting mine with a sincerity I hadn't seen in years. "Thank you, Winfred, for being her father, for being braver than I was." I nodded, my throat tight, unable to find words. Lula slipped out the door, her footsteps soft against the porch, leaving Agnes and me alone in the dining room. The check still lay on the table, its edges curling slightly as if wilting under the weight of our truth. Agnes picked it up, her fingers steady now, and tore it in half with a slow, deliberate motion. The sound was sharp, final, a rejection of the world Eldon represented. "I don't need it," she said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting mine with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "I'll start smaller. I'll build it myself, like you did." The words were a mirror, reflecting the strength I'd tried to instill in her, the resilience I'd shown through every loss, my job, my marriage, my place in her life. I smiled, a real smile, the kind that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You'll do it better than I ever did," I said, my voice thick with pride. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that filled the room with warmth. "Maybe, but I had a pretty good teacher." She gestured to the pie, the coffee, the table that had borne witness to our unraveling and our mending. "Let's eat. I'm starving." We sat, just the two of us. Now the dining room no longer a battlefield, but a sanctuary. I cut slices of pie apple, her favorite, and poured fresh coffee, the ritual grounding us in a moment that felt like a new beginning. We talked not about the adoption or the check or the years of distance, but about small things, her favorite coffee shop, the book I was reading, the way the oak trees outside my window turned golden in the fall. It was ordinary, and yet It was everything a reclaiming of the bond we'd nearly lost. As we ate, Agnes's gaze wandered to the photo albums still scattered on the coffee table in the living room visible through the doorway. "Can we look at those later?" she asked, her voice soft, almost shy. "The pictures. I want to remember." "Of course," I said, my heart swelling. "There's one from the zoo when you were 7. You had chocolate ice cream all over your face." She laughed again, the sound brighter now, unburdened. "I remember that day. You carried me when I got tired. You were my superhero." "I still am," I said, the words half joking, half serious. A promise I'd never break. She reached across the table, her hand finding mine, her fingers warm and steady. "I know, Dad," she said, and the word Dad was a melody, a reclamation of everything we'd nearly lost. "I know." The afternoon stretched on, the light softening as the sun dipped toward the horizon. We cleared the table together, her movements easy, familiar, as if she'd never left. The house felt alive again, its creaks and sighs, a chorus of welcome rather than loneliness. I caught glimpses of the girl she'd been, the one who'd climbed my treehouse, who'd laughed at my terrible jokes, and saw the woman she'd become, strong and resilient, ready to forge her own path. As she prepared to leave, Agnes paused at the front door, her hand on the knob, her eyes meeting mine with a clarity that took my breath away. "I'll come back soon," she said, her voice firm, a vow of her own. "Not just for a few hours. For real." "I'll be here," I said, my voice steady, my heart full. "Always." She hugged me again, her arms tight, her breath warm against my shoulder. And then she was gone. Her car disappearing down the street, leaving me alone, but not empty. The house settled around me, its quiet no longer oppressive but peaceful, a canvas for the future we'd begin to rebuild. I walked back to the dining room, the torn check still on the table, a symbol of a victory I hadn't anticipated. I'd built bridges once, structures that defied gravity and time. And today I'd built one more, not with steel but with truth and love. A bridge that Agnes had crossed, not burned. The secret of her origins, once a hidden blade, was now a beacon guiding us back to each other. The grandfather clock chimed its notes, a gentle promise of time moving forward, of days yet to come. I stood in the doorway, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Agnes was my daughter not by blood, but by choice, and that choice was stronger than any check, any betrayal, any doubt. We'd found our way back, and the road ahead was ours to walk together. The evening light spilled through my living room window, painting the walls in hues of gold and shadow, as if the house itself were exhaling after the storm of Father's Day. The dining room table stood cleared now, the torn remnants of Eldon's $100,000 check swept into the trash, a discarded symbol of a victory I hadn't needed to claim with money. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the hallway, its rhythm no longer a countdown to loss, but a steady pulse of possibility. I stood alone in my home, the quiet no longer oppressive, but serene, a canvas for the future Agnes and I would build together. I sank into my armchair, the leather creaking under my weight, and picked up the zoo picture from the coffee table. Agnes at 7, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream, her hand clutching mine as we stood before the elephant enclosure. Her gap-toothed grin was a beacon, a reminder of the girl who'd once called me her superhero, and now, after years of distance and a truth that had shaken us to our core, she'd called me Dad again. The word echoed in my heart, a melody of reclamation, a bridge rebuilt, not with steel, but with the unbreakable choice I'd made 33 years ago. The adoption papers still locked in my office drawer no longer felt like a hidden blade. They were a testament now, a record of the moment I'd chosen Agnes as my daughter, not out of obligation, but out of a love so fierce it had carried me through every loss, my job, my marriage, the years when Agnes had drifted into Eldon's orbit. That choice had been my strength, a quiet power that had sustained me when the world seemed determined to reduce me to nothing. And today it had brought her back. I leaned back, the photo resting in my lap, and let my gaze wander to the living room shelves, where the photo albums sat like sentinels of our shared history. Each one held a piece of the life we'd built. Her first bike ride, her high school graduation, the Christmas mornings filled with laughter and wrapping paper. Those memories were no longer relics of a lost past, but promises of a future we could reclaim. Agnes had left with a vow to return not for a fleeting 3 hours, but for real, for the conversations and moments that would stitch us back together. The truth I'd revealed, her adoption, her origins in a gray orphanage, with nothing but a tattered rabbit, had been a storm uprooting the lies we'd lived with, but it had also cleared the air. Agnes had torn Eldon's check, rejecting the easy path of wealth for the harder, truer path of building her own future. "Like you did," she'd said, and those words were a crown, a recognition of the resilience I'd shown her, the strength that had carried us both through this day. I rose and walked to the kitchen, the scent of roasted herbs lingering faintly, a reminder of the meal that had started as a plea for connection and ended as a rebirth. The dishes were done, the table cleared, but the space felt alive now, filled with the echo of Agnes's laughter, her apology, her promise to return. I poured a fresh cup of coffee, the ritual grounding me, and carried it to the porch, where the evening air was cool and fragrant with the neighbors' jasmine. The suburban street stretched before me, its houses glowing with the warmth of other families, but I no longer felt like an outsider in their light. My home, small and worn as it was a sanctuary again, a place where love had triumphed over betrayal. I thought of Lula, her tearful regret, and her acknowledgement of my role as Agnes's father. I thought of Eldon, his polished confidence crumbling in the face of a truth he couldn't buy. And I thought of Agnes, my daughter, who'd faced the shattering of her identity and chosen to embrace the love that had always defined her. The secret of her adoption, once a shadow I'd feared would break us, had become a beacon illuminating the strength of our bond. I'd built bridges once as an engineer, structures that defied gravity and time. And today I'd built one more, not with steel or concrete, but with the truth, a bridge that had carried Agnes back to me, not as a stranger, but as my daughter chosen and loved. I sipped my coffee, the warmth spreading through me, and watched the stars emerge in the deepening sky. They were faint at first, like the hope I'd clung to through years of loneliness, but growing brighter with each moment. Agnes would return, and we'd look through those photo albums together, laugh over old memories and make new ones. She'd build her business not with Eldon's money, but with her own strength, a strength I'd helped forge. The grandfather clock chimed inside its notes, a gentle promise of days to come. I set the photo down, its edges worn but its image clear, and felt a peace settle over me, deep and unshakable. The world had tried to reduce me to a failed engineer, a discarded husband, a forgotten father, but I was more than that. I was the man who'd chosen Agnes, who'd loved her through every storm, who'd spoken a truth that had set us both free. As I stepped back inside, the house felt different. No longer a relic of loss, but a home filled with possibility. The albums waited, the coffee pot hummed, and the quiet was no longer empty but expectant, a space where love could grow again. I'd faced betrayal and emerged stronger, not because of wealth or power, but because of the choice I'd made 33 years ago, a choice that had defined me and would define us forever.